Lost Cities of the Classical Mayans by D.W. Draffin. In 1992, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to Rigoberta Menchú Tum for her work in advancing the cause of indigenous rights in her native Guatemala. Born and raised in the remote community of Lajchimel, she identifies as Quiche, a word in their language which means many trees. The Nahuatl, or Uto-Aztecan translation of Quiche is Guatemalan, which is the root of the word Guatemala. The Quiche come from a different lineage than the Aztecs, though. They are one of the Mayan families of language and ethnicity. Their long history has been well documented back to the Mayan ethnogenesis, and their power reached its zenith during the Mayan postclassical period over 1,000 years ago. As outsiders, we commonly believe several things about the Maya. First, that they have vanished, that they are a mysterious race of ancients with no living descendants. Nothing could be further from the truth. Over 7 million people of Mayan ethnicity live in the region today, and their impact can be felt in literature, politics, music, and sport worldwide. Second, that they were a monolithic polity with a single identity. Yet, the Quiche people do not refer to themselves as Mayan. Many of the indigenous groups of Chiapas, the Yucatán, Belize, Guatemala, and El Salvador do not see themselves as part of a wider Mayan identity, and many of their over 30 languages cannot be understood by the others. And the third assumption we make is that we believe archaeologists and historians have already made the most significant discoveries about the origins of the Mayan peoples. 2 new studies have upended this third assumption. Teams of researchers working in the dense cloud forests and jungles of the region have revealed ancient structures and networks of canals and roads that indicate we have dramatically underestimated the scale and complexity of Mayan empires. And these discoveries have also helped to contradict the second assumption, that the Mayan ethnic groups were in any way monolithic. Instead, each distinct geographical and ecological region hosted its own kingdom or community during various eras, and these would rise and fall in power for a variety of reasons over the ages, drawing in their neighbors as vassal states and then collapsing in turn, a process they have engaged in over the millennia. Even certain local conflicts of today possess this fractious ethnic component, rooted in history. The first of these studies is the discovery of what the researchers have named Okom Tun, an entire city that has been hidden beneath dense vegetation for hundreds of years. Located in the Balamcu Ecological Conservation Zone in the Mexican state of Campeche, this hidden metropolis is built on a high plateau surrounded by wetlands. Initial analysis of pottery found here indicates that the site was used mostly from 600 to 800 CE, with a final abandonment around 1000 CE during what is known more widely as the Classic Maya collapse. The city is massive, with multiple pyramids which rise nearly 20 meters in height. Ceremonial, residential, and administrative buildings form several nuclei that are divided into various grades of major and minor centers. Lineage shrines are found in nearly every center, large or small, as well as plazas from which roads and paths connect to others. The surprise discovery of Okom Tun indicates that the book remains very much unwritten on the history of ancient Mayan ethnic groups. And it is also a profound example of the power of LIDAR, or radar technology that allows researchers to peer beneath tree cover and vegetation to detect the presence of human changes to the landscape. Used increasingly by archaeologists the world over, the use of new technologies such as LIDAR are revealing levels of historical and archaeological detail that were previously unimaginable. The second recent discovery is also the product of LIDAR, and it changes even more of what we thought we knew about the ancient Mayan peoples. Located in Guatemala and covering an enormous 1,000 square kilometers, investigators from multiple institutions worked together to peel back layers of greenery and found the remains of an entire 2,000-year-old civilization. Linked by nearly 180 kilometers of causeways and roads, these settlements and towns grew densely populated. This contradicts the conventional wisdom of the Mesoamerican archaeological community. Tell a specialist from 20 years ago that Guatemala's Mirador Kalakmul karst basin was settled this heavily 4,000 years ago, they would hardly believe you. And the fact that the settlements were so densely populated changes forever the assumptions we make about the classical Mayan ethnic groups. With all that in mind, it is time to take a longer look at the origins and development of the Mayan peoples, their periods and historical details, in light of these new discoveries. Let's start, as much as we can, at the beginning. The latest models for the spread of humans in the Americas are highly contentious, although there is now a growing acceptance of the legitimacy of dates which are still shocking and unbelievable to many in the field. But papers are being published that argue for the arrival of humans in Mesoamerica over 30,000 years ago, before the advent of the last glacial maximum. In a 2020 Nature article titled Evidence of Human Occupation in Mexico Around the Last Glacial Maximum, the authors state, "The initial colonization of the Americas remains a highly debated topic, and the exact timing of the first arrivals is unknown. The earliest archaeological record of Mexico is poorly known and understudied. Historically, the region has remained on the periphery of research focused on the first American populations. Here we present results of recent excavations at Chiquihuite Cave, a high-altitude site in central northern Mexico that corroborate previous findings in the Americas of cultural evidence that dates to the last glacial maximum, 26,500 to 19,000 years ago, and which push back dates for human dispersal to the region possibly as early as 33,000 to 31,000 years ago. The site yielded about 1,900 stone artifacts within a 3-meter-deep stratified sequence, revealing a previously unknown lithic industry that underwent only minor changes over millennia. More than 50 radiocarbon and luminescence readings document the changing environments in which the occupants lived. Our results provide new evidence for the antiquity of humans in the Americas, illustrate the cultural diversity of the earliest dispersal groups, which predate those of the Clovis culture, and open new directions of research. Genetically and linguistically, the peoples of the Mayan region today are fascinating. They live in widespread villages and towns among the highlands and lowlands and coasts of oceans and seas. Possessing around 1 million speakers of their languages each, the largest cultural groups are the Quiche, the Yucatán Maya, and the Quechua, while the Tzeltal and Tzotzil of Chiapas each possess 500,000 speakers, as do the Mam of the Guatemalan highlands. The Quechua today number perhaps 1.3 million, making them the largest cultural group, yet their demographic success came after the end of the Mayan classical civilization. Various genetic studies have found likely links to populations as widely distributed as the Inupiat, Chukchi, and Samoyeds of Alaska to the Zuni and Na-Dene peoples of the Southwest, to the Waiapi of Brazil and the Aymara of the Central Andes in South America. Certain genetic profiles have neighboring Mayan cultures in Guatemala more genetically related to Alaskan ethnicities than to each other. How? What kind of migration model could this suggest? Well, 30,000 years is a long time. It is certainly long enough for people to traverse the length and width of the Americas innumerable times. Anthropologists speak about waves of migrations and singular demographic shifts that occur on specific dates, but recent evidence is beginning to reveal a process of endless movement and a constant shift of populations across the landscape. Nowhere is this more evident than in the lands that will someday be those of the Maya. For tens of thousands of years, nomads filled the Americas, following herds of prey animals and living lightly on the land. In the lands of southern Mesoamerica, these were Paleo-Indians who never cleared the forests and tamed them. And why would they? Theirs was a lush landscape filled with food and herbal medicine. They had learned over millennia how to not only survive in this dense wilderness filled with sinkholes and predators, but to thrive. After thousands of years of movement, finally we see a record of settlements in the region. At Cuello, in Belize, coastal settlements have been identified that indicate semi-permanent occupation around 3400 BCE. Similar settlements around Veracruz along the Caribbean coast have been dated to around 2500 BCE. There is also the rise of a string of coastal settlements across this broad isthmus along the Pacific coast in western Guatemala, and it is the cultivation of their first crop which gives us the first details of permanent changes they made on the land. These early agriculturalists domesticated cacao as their first crop and brewed sacred, bitter drinks of chocolate. Nearly 1,000 years later, around 1600 BCE, the first formal culture in the region arises in these two sides of the isthmus. Along the Caribbean, the region is known as La Venta, and the first major center was located on an island in a swamp in a delta of combined rivers. Along the Pacific coast, the peoples there were called the Mocaya, and together, along with Michzoque-speaking settlements in the interior between them, the people of La Venta formed the foundation of what would be known later as Olmec culture. The heartland of their civilization remained in this region of Tabasco, with major settlements at San Lorenzo by 1200 BCE, including a red palace, pyramids, ball courts, canals, and drains that were cut in the basalt of San Lorenzo's mounds, and trade routes among settlements. Their precious goods included obsidian and polished mirrors and jade. We have done episodes on the Olmec in the past, and their barely understood culture is slowly coming a bit more into focus. Olmec is also not what they called themselves. It is an Aztec word. It means the rubber people. Their major centers at La Venta, San Lorenzo, and Laguna de los Cerros are all built in the same ordered fashion. In the ceremonial district of La Venta, the streets all align north-south, and the emblematic giant heads of Olmec culture sit at cardinal points, facing out, as if guarding the site. Apart from their jaguar god and perhaps 7 others, there is little known about their religion. But a key component seems to be the mystical power of caves and underground passages. This region is famous for its cenotes, or sinkholes, that exist in vast profusion beneath the limestone shelves of the Yucatán and elsewhere. Years ago, my wife and I traveled to Chichen Itza and Uxmal and Tulum. Near where Okom Tun was just discovered, we took a guided cave tour with a Mayan guide. Deep underground, he led us past a cenote with crystal-clear water and a massive chamber with a skylight far above. Then we crawled into a smaller room, and along its walls were the ancient outlines of hands, with paint blown around their silhouettes in several colors. He said the hand paintings predated all civilization here, but all the hands only had 4 fingers, their thumbs missing. The guide asked the dozen tourists why they thought the hands looked like this, and we offered ideas about thumbs being taboo, being lopped off of sacrificial victims, of those born without thumbs being perhaps exalted. No, he interrupted us, aliens. These are the hands of aliens. Now, before we veer off into fevered imaginings of alien theory crafting that tickle our Western social media excesses and science fiction sensibilities, and also before we dismiss these ideas out of hand with our sober, rationalist, Western academic rigor, it is important to recognize that a belief in aliens is one of the foundations of the culture that the Olmec bequeathed to their descendants. For them, not only do gods and the dead emerge from underground, people descend from the stars and speak to us. And it is said that they continue to come to this day, with belief in aliens widespread in the region. Yet, this being YouTube, it must be stated that it remains belief, with no compelling evidence found. Many of the other hallmarks of Mesoamerica culture, such as pyramid construction, ball games, and a pantheon of snake and jaguar gods whose initial domains were unclear and whose names remain unknown, can be traced to the Olmec. There has long been an academic dispute over whether the Olmec were the direct ancestors of the Maya, or if the Maya were newcomers who pushed the Olmec out. But recent discoveries show that the reality was far more complex. Even as the Olmec centers began to wane in power around 450 BCE, Mayan centers already existed alongside them. Genetics and linguistics show that it was not a matter of direct ancestry or immigration and replacement. It was both, and repeatedly. Remember what genetics has taught us. If it sounds preposterous that haplogroups of Alaskan natives once migrated to the jungles of Guatemala to take up residence between competing local groups of pre-Olmec cultures, only consider the epic journey of the Na-Dene people of the Alaskan coast over 1,000 years ago. They also traveled inland, perhaps in response to the eruption in the St. Elias Mountains in 803 CE, and transited south along the spine of the Rocky Mountains to settle in the arid deserts of New Mexico and Arizona among the Pueblo as the Navajo. Certain Mayan groups share similar genetic profiles to these Na-Dene migrants. By 400 BCE, the Olmec have abandoned their centers and settlements. Various reasons have been proposed, but none have been conclusively proven, whether it is climate change leading to the collapse of their agriculture, or the silting of their rivers, or volcanic or tectonic activity that made their formerly bountiful regions nearly uninhabitable. The region became so unfavorable to human development that it remained sparsely populated until the 19th century CE. But beginning 2,800 years ago, the lands of Chiapas and Yucatán, of Belize and Guatemala and regions of Honduras and El Salvador, belonged to the ethnic groups we call the Maya. The Maya emerged from their archaic period over 4,000 years ago and established settlements and then urban centers and cities across the land. And by land we mean in large part a karst plain, which is a limestone shelf that is commonly shot through with underground caves and tunnels. Above, the soils are sparse and the vegetation dense. There are highlands with low ranges of hills and prominences, elevated plateaus and mesas, but for the most part, it is marshy lowlands with a water table just beneath the surface that hosts secret underground lakes. This next phase of the preclassic period of the Maya civilization really began in 2000 BCE, with the advent of sites like Cuello in Belize along with Soconusco down the coast from Veracruz. The development of the lowlands with agriculture began at this time, with the cultivation of chili peppers and maize and beans and squash. The populations settled in permanent sites, and the new civilization began to emerge. As the Preclassic period progressed from early to middle to late, more centers became densely populated and villages transitioned into cities. The earliest major city might be Nakbe in northern Guatemala, which began to consolidate power around 1400 BCE in what is called the early formative period. Located near a limestone quarry that yielded building materials for a wider and wider area, by 1200 BCE, the citizens of Nakbe had flattened their villages to make way for larger structures that suited their status as a regional power. By 800 BCE, they used their limestone to build a significant monumental area, with pyramids and elevated causeways paved with crushed white stone called sakbe. These causeways became longer and more significant, connecting not only monuments to each other, but to areas in the city and eventually to other far-flung cities such as El Mirador and Kalakmul. Those who traveled on these sakbe-op causeways followed routes that appear to have been sacred, with prayers documented for crossings and ornamental gateways or arches at each end of what they called the Road of Life. Researchers wonder why so many thousands of kilometers of causeway were built when the monumental effort seemed to outweigh the gain. Some see it as an economic and spiritual signifier that in many ways lies at the heart of the Mayan identity, but as a simpler explanation, in a land that is often flooded with venomous snakes and giant constrictors, crocodiles, and giant cats, I, too, would want the safety of a long, elevated road. For anyone who has trekked overland across the region, you would know what a blessing a straight and level road would be, free from any dangers. That in itself could form the basis of a religion. Early Mayans of high social status would inlay their teeth with jade. They would bind the heads of their infants to give them a high sloping forehead throughout their lives. They would honor the dead, spending far more time with their deceased ancestors than most of us do with our living ones. The great figures of their natural world were the sky and sea, the jaguar god who descended into the underworld each night and returned each dawn, the bird and snake gods, and the gods of sea and mountain and sky. In Nakbe, we see some of the first carvings that may depict the events of the Popol Vuh, a sacred text composed during the millennia of oral tradition, then recorded by a Spanish priest over 15 years at the beginning of the 18th century. The Popol Vuh text deserves its own episode. Its hundreds of verses contain everything from geology and geography to cosmology and creation myths. It also holds what appears to be one of the core myths of the region's culture, which is the story of the twin heroes Hunahpu and Xbalanque, who play ball games with the gods and are killed when they lose. But in certain versions of this widely told tale, their direct descendants, another set of twins known as Hunahpu and Vucub-Hunuaqpu, fulfilled their destinies by returning to the home of the gods and defeating them, then going on to defeat the bird demon Vucub-Kakich. The transliteration here is from Quiche, the same language spoken by Rigoberta Menchú Tum. This passage goes, "Thus we shall tell now when he died, 7 Macaw, when he was defeated, when were made people by framer, shaper. This its root, his defeat. It's shaking now as well his day, 7 Macaw, by 2 boys, Hunahpu his name one, Xbalanque his name second, merely gods, because evil they saw him, the self-aggrandizer. He wanted its doing, before his face its heart sky. Said therefore the boys, not good then it shall come to be, not will live people here on its face earth. Thus we will try blowgun shooting. Above his food we will blowgun shoot him. There we will put his sickness. Then finished his wealth, his jade, his precious metals, his jewels, his glittering things, that which he keeps vigil over. Thus it will be done. The translator of the above verses, Alan Christensen, writes, according to the Popol Vuh, the founders of the various Quichean lineages traveled a great distance eastward across the sea to an epi-Toltec city called Tulan, where they received their titular gods and tokens of kingship. Tulan is a Nahua word meaning place of reeds, or more broadly, city, in the sense that it is filled with a great multitude of people as reeds crowd the shores of a lake or river. Many major Toltec-influenced ceremonial and administrative centers were therefore called Tulan. As a result, it is difficult to identify precisely which Tulan the Quiche progenitors saw as the origin of their power, although it was likely located somewhere on the Yucatán Peninsula. Chichen Itza, or its successor Mayapan, are good possibilities for this Tulan. The Popol Vuh has a wealth of detail about the Mayan perspective. The framer and shaper who helped Cucumatz, the feathered serpent, to create the world. How time is told in chord lengths that can be stretched and compressed. Certain wicked animal gods who are not only cruel in action but in speech, mocking and berating and condescending the hero twins. Their destiny in some versions was to ascend into the heavens as the sun and moon when they died. The largest of all Mayan cities, El Mirador, was founded near the end of the Preclassic period. Over 26 square kilometers in area, it was built on a prominence in the same Mirador-Kalakmul karst basin in northern Guatemala, where the 1,000 square kilometer developed area was just discovered with LIDAR. The La Danta Temple is one of the largest pyramids in the world, and including the enormous platform on which it is built, the entire structure is one of the largest monuments of antiquity. Another core element of classical Mayan culture is their calendar, or more specifically, the two calendars they use, the 260-day Tzolk'in and the 365-day Hap. The Tzolk'in, or as the Quiche call it, the Ajlabal Kich, contains 20 unique day names, each with their own characteristics. They are repeated 13 times to make a full cycle. These 260 days can be matched to the cycles of the moon, the planting of maize, and, probably most significantly, the gestation and birth of children. It is known as the earthly calendar, concerned with the doings of people in their daily lives. The Hap calendar is an astronomical calendar. Connecting the two calendars at specific dates where their cycles match are the Mam, the 4 Mayan year-bearers. To find the current date, those who used and still use these calendars count forward from a specific date which they refer to as the first day of creation. So, in Mayan cosmology, many adherents of this system count as the very first day, August 11th, 3114 BCE. On this date, raised-up Sky Lord centered the cosmos with the help of the eponymous gods Lying Down Sky and First 3 Stone Place, by fixing 3 stones in place, lifting the dark sky from the primordial sea. The countless ways this calendar have recently been appropriated and misused have been well documented, and not much needs to be said after the New Age apocalyptic nonsense of 2012 failed to end the world at the end of one of the calendar cycles. But a more important point to be made with this dating system is that its widespread use marks the beginning of the Mayan classical period. The first discovered use of the calendar on their monuments is in 36 BCE at Chiapa de Corzo, although other more worn monuments may hold earlier representations. This calendar was not only used by the Maya. Related cultures such as the Olmec and Epi-Olmec, as well as the Zapotec culture to the west, contain inscriptions of their own versions. 2,000 years ago, the most dominant power in Mesoamerica wasn't Mayan or Olmec or Zapotec, however. It was the growing empire of Teotihuacan, located in the mountain lake region near Mexico City known as the Valley of Mexico. Academics still argue over the ethnic composition of this city-state, with many seeing them as ancestors of the Aztec and Nahuatl traditions, but others see them as a more cosmopolitan admixture of immigrants from surrounding regions. It was the Teotihuacan warlord Siaj-Kak, whose name means fire is born, in 378 CE, who introduced the culture and social organization of Teotihuacan to Guatemalan Mayans. How he accomplished this is a matter of great debate. Most scholars will say it was by conquest. The king of Tikal, Chaktok Ichak I, died on the same day Siaj-Kak arrived. But others point to a more gradual economic and social movement over time that eventually imported many desirable customs and cultural trends from the north. Also, there are indications that Siaj-Kak was not an emissary of spear-thrower Owl, the king of Teotihuacan, but may have instead been an outcast leader of a feathered serpent movement that was ejected from the city once its temples were burned. It is written that the transfer of power in Tikal was accomplished with the aid of nearby Mayan powers Okom Tun and Waka, or El Peru. This created a rivalry in the Petén basin of the Mayan lowlands during the 4th and 5th centuries between Tikal and its new Teotihuacan-backed line of kings and the other great city-state of the region, Kalakmul. With a population of as much as 50,000 at its peak in the 7th and 8th centuries, Kalakmul grew to cover nearly 20 square kilometers, and its Great Pyramid is over 45 meters high. A complex canal system managed the adjacent swamp and its seasonal floods, and the citizens of the city harvested and worked with abundant flint deposits. Already a city in the pre-classical period, the original rulers of Kalakmul are represented by the totem animal of a bat, but by its rise in the classical period, the rulers use a snake emblem known as Kan, and Kalakmul is known as the Kingdom of the Snake. Its kings are known as Kuhul Kanal Aja, or Divine Lords of the Snake. While Tikal followed single male rulers, Kalakmul seems to have preferred matrilineal descent, or at least the joint rule of queens and kings. This fundamental rivalry with Tikal shapes much of the classical period in this region, with client states and allies on both sides choosing spheres of cultural and religious influence and fighting proxy wars for hundreds of years. While Tikal and its allies counted nearly 500,000 citizens in their cities and towns, Kalakmul and its allies only numbered half that, or less. But Tikal could not overwhelm them with numbers. In fact, Kalakmul did well to contain the spread of the Tikal domain by giving support to their antagonistic neighbors such as Caracol, El Peru, the Waka had turned on their former Teotihuacan-backed allies, and El Zots. In 537 CE, several important Aja lords were captured by Tikal and their allies from Kalakmul and their allies. This led to the outbreak of open war between the two powers, a ruinous conflict that lasted 35 years, until 572 CE, and ended with the conquest of Naranjo by Kalakmul and the defeat of Tikal. Balaj Chan Kawil, the son of the much-weakened Tikal king, was sent to the frontier town of Dos Pilas. Here he engaged in constant warfare with the forces of Kalakmul. After years of heavy fighting, Dos Pilas was eventually overrun and Balaj Chan Kawil was exiled. But his return in 648 CE on the side of Kalakmul against his brothers and father began another major war. For nearly 40 years, Balaj Chan Kawil held Dos Pilas as its own independent kingdom backed by Kalakmul, and finally, near the end of his life, in 679 CE, his efforts paid off. He took Tikal itself and sacrificed its king, his own brother, upon its pyramid. Other centers during this period are Copan, at the border of Honduras and Guatemala, as well as Palenque and Yaxchilan to the northeast. Their development was also distorted by the struggle of the great powers, with Copan influenced by faraway Teotihuacan. Despite such obstacles, or perhaps because of them, the cultural flowering of the classical Mayan period has drawn comparisons to Athenian Greece and the Renaissance. Astronomy, religion, trade, textiles, song, literature, massive monumental building projects, they all reach their first major expression during this time. This period is also when slavery and human sacrifice seems to have become widely practiced. While it is probably true that pre-Olmec and pre-Mayan cultures engaged in slavery to a certain degree, it was only with the increased mobility, more intense warfare, and social stratification of the classical Mayan period that the rulers of these power centers developed institutional slavery. Enslavement could be enforced on members of one's own society who were paying off a debt or the sentence of a crime, as well as captives from their many wars. People could also be born into slavery, and entire slave lineages were established. Yet, high-status captives were less useful as slaves. Instead, they were highly prized as sacrifices. The initiation of an agricultural season, or construction of a major causeway or monument, would require the blood of captured royalty to make it auspicious. The gods desired human blood, thirsted for it, and were satiated most by the blood and tears of royalty. But if one didn't have quality, then quantity must do, with many documented episodes of hundreds of captives and slaves being tortured, disemboweled, and beheaded to satisfy the thirsty gods. The classical period is notable for the rise of elites within Mayan society. Things were much more egalitarian in the good old days. But in their iconography and statuary, theology became more and more focused on providing rationales for the existence of a divine nobility and royalty. Many cities became ruled by kings who transferred power to their eldest sons. These would commonly be identified with the young maize god of the Mayan pantheon. This god has many aspects, each with their own name. The two major aspects are the young leafy god, who is the essence of the life-giving maize plant, and the much more complex and adaptable version of the maize god, who is tonsured. He is more of a personality than the emblematic stalks and ears of maize, and he represents everything from creator of the universe to the rainy season to the possibility of resurrection. Consider the caves of Tunich in Guatemala. Situated on a cliff face over 200 meters above the valley floor, it contains a treasure of cave art, illustrations, and evidence of activity that stretches back millennia. Human sacrifices were performed in its depths and gifts left to the gods of the underworld. For many, visiting these underground shrines was an attempt to cleanse oneself of the impure human world above. This was a core tenet of their religion. Humans were unclean. Finding places unsullied by human contact was a main reason for their pilgrimages to remote sites. And once again we return to the divine nature of their causeways, the roads of life on which the pilgrims traveled. The religion of the Mayans is a vast subject. There are over 200 named gods from the Mayan classic period, and many others who make minor appearances. They can be found recorded in the various Mayan codices, which were written on fig bark paper 1,000 years ago. One, held in Dresden, Germany, contains 78 pages of hieroglyphs and mathematical notation recovered from the region around Chichen Itza. Their subjects are not only the gods, but also medical and astronomical information. This text was written around the 12th century and refers to another text, written 300 or 400 years prior to that, as the source for its inspiration. The Maya Codex from Chiapas is yet older, discovered in a dry cave in 1960 with a turquoise mask. Written in the early 11th century, it charts the cycle of Venus, representing a war god whose appearance in the sky would mean conflict was coming. Portraits of gods and captives fill its pages, along with mountains and planets and fight scenes. They indicate a lurid outlook on the daily world of the early Maya, with the gods nearby, and war or slavery a very real concern. Chak, the rain god, features prominently in many of these texts. 4 aspects of the gods occupy the cardinal directions, differentiated by color. The red Chak of the east was known as Chak-Chib Chak, and he represented other elements of daily life than the other Chaks. These were closely associated with the 4 Bakabs, or 4 old men at each of the cardinal directions, also differentiated by color, who hold up the sky dragon overhead. But not all gods were aspects of the natural world. Some were creator deities, such as Itzamna, who was credited with the invention of writing and the division of the land of the Yucatán Peninsula. Others, such as Ishtab, who is always shown with a noose around her neck, has been interpreted as the goddess of suicides, which makes many commenters remark on the high suicide rate in the Yucatan, twice the rate of the national Mexican average. But others see Ishtab as a hunting goddess, and they consider this fabrication of a suicide cult harmful to the local communities. But to derive a Western-style meaning or thesis of classical Mayan religion remains beyond us. Certain important elements are clear: the need for balance and the power of cycles, the capricious and voracious nature of the gods, the demand for ritual and observance of sacred rites, and the dominion of the natural world over the affairs of humans. But the central mysteries remain mysterious. Wandering the empty monument district of Uxmal, I've never felt less familiar with my surroundings. There is so little evidence of what kinds of ordinary daily activities may have occurred on or around the massive structures. Observance of Venus, with its phases being included with Chak, the rain god, seem to have been of primary importance. The classical Mayan period ended with a dramatic collapse of their civilization around 900 CE. It is likely that a combination of factors led to the abandonment of their lowland cities in the south and a wholesale migration to the north, into the northern Mayan cities of the Yucatan and as far as the Valley of Mexico. Overpopulation, combined with drought and a collapse of the agricultural and environmental health of the region, led to an increase in warfare as resources dwindled and the gods turned against them. The veneration of ritual and tradition failed them here, because the god-king system on which so many of their societies had been built could not adapt quickly enough to the changing world, although, notably, certain centers in the north of the Mayan regions did adapt and switched at this time to a council of nobles instead of the rule of a king. The lowland Petén region, however, faced a collapse so severe that its cities were mostly abandoned over 50 to 100 years. The post-classical period began around 950 CE with the re-establishment of certain cities of the north, such as Chichen Itza. Those who claimed that the Mayan collapse was precipitated by a severe drought like to use as supporting evidence the fact that nearly all the new centers of population are situated beside permanent sources of water. But Chichen Itza also faced its own decline, only a century or two later, and the centers of Mayan culture shifted once again. Mayapan was one of the last cities of the ancient Mayans, with various founding myths having settlers called the Okom, coming from Chichen Itza or others from Uxmal, to found a dynasty that lasted until the 15th century CE. One of the few remaining Mayan cities of the post-classical period that was still inhabited when the Spaniards arrived in the 16th century was Cumarcach. The jaguar god Tohil was the patron of the city, and monuments in the central plaza are dedicated to him: Awilish, goddess of the moon; Jacawitz, the mountain deity; and the feathered serpent. Cumarcach was the capital of the Quiche kingdom, the same Quiche people who, 1,000 years later, gave the world the Nobel Peace Prize recipient, Rigoberta Menchú Tum. Her award was for advancing the cause of indigenous rights in Mesoamerica. Today, the Mayan communities of Mexico, Belize, and Guatemala hold very little of the economic and political power of the region, but their communities remain vibrant and filled with the chosen colors of each clan or village. Their languages and the music fill the air, mutually indistinguishable from their longtime neighbors, but each possessing well-embroidered tapestries of parallel traditions that reach back thousands of years into prehistory.